Okay, I'm gonna kick this off. Thank you. Am I muted?
Nope, you are good. We hear you great.
Okay. So just to let you all know, in case I do get muted, I don't have my typical computer setup with me right now, and so it may get a little wonky, but I've got people in the background telling me that. So welcome to our fifth in the series of the Stronger Together, a roadmap to an effective homeless system. And today we're going to talk about the component of our system, emergency shelter. And the focus of the session today is exactly what that title says. How do we reimagine our shelter as a housing focused place that people actually want to come into and see it as a place where they can feel safe and they're going to get the resources and the assistance they need to be housed? Okay, so again, we talked a little bit about this. If you joined us and heard the little video that we did, is that, this is the National Alliance to End Homelessness has as our mission to end homelessness. We work on that in three ways: through our policy department, through our research department, and through our capacity building department. And the reason we're here and putting on this series is just to make sure that we realize that we are all together in this. We're all a system, and we really need to think of each of us have to coordinate and connect with what's going on in our system as we work together to end homelessness. So just a couple of statements. I'm not going to read all of these. They're on your screen. You can read, but what we want to make sure is that this needs to be a safe and welcoming place for everyone, and that we expect everybody to treat each other with respect through chat, through the questions and answers, and we will not tolerate any form of discrimination, violence, or abusive behavior. And if we see that, we'll remove that person from the webinar. So we want to make sure that this is a diverse, inclusive, accepting space where we can talk about things that we can learn from each other, and particularly learn from our amazing panelists today. But before I turn it over to them, a couple of things in housekeeping. So if you have a question that you want the panelists to answer, please put that in the Q&A. We have the Q&A enabled, and that's where you put your questions. The chat box is just to chat back and forth with each other. We do have our whole team, the capacity team is on this call today. They're going to be in the, watching the chat boxes, answering questions. They'll also be answering questions as they can through the Q&A. So, and at the same time, just look for links. There'll be different links that we'll be putting up, and there will be accompanying documents as well. The webinar is being recorded, and all of the recording, our accompanying documents. That word is going to be hard for me to say today. Accompanying documents, and the slides will be available on our website after the webinar is over. And so this is, I said, the fifth in our series, that we're stronger together when all of us work together in our communities, in our continuums as programs, and not think of ourselves as sort of separate from all the other programs, but that rather we're linked together. That's what's going to create the most effective system. And so I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the system. You can see on the screen, the session for today. But next month in June, we're going to be talking about rapid rehousing. The registration link will be there and will be live, that you can start registering for that session as well. So why did we decide to do the Stronger Together? We have learned when we're in communities, the work that we've been doing in our technical assistance and training and previous webinars, is that too often, even we at the Alliance are focusing on one piece of the system. And, for example, I'm recently in a community, talking about housing first, but you can't talk about housing first without talking about the entire system. And so the purpose of the systems, why we're better, stronger together, is that when we come together, we can create the most effective system and keep that system flow going. So what is the most important thing in an equitable, effective, and effective system? So first of all, whenever possible, we want to divert people from homelessness, right? We want to make sure that at that front door, is there a way that we can get people connected with services before they come into the homeless system so that they do not need to come into the homeless system and can either stay where they are or find alternatives? That's the first thing in an effective system. And the second thing is that if folks are in the system, we want to house people as quickly as possible. And as we go into the emergency shelter part of this today, I think sometimes within our system, we have housing programs. And so sometimes I think we can say, well, we're not a rapid housing provider, or we're not, a housing provider or a PSH provider. And so, housing is someone else's job. But the reality is it's all of our jobs, no matter where somebody hits our system, is that even in emergency shelters, are there conversations that we could have during intake that would divert people from homelessness? And how do we start also looking at our job as housing people quickly? So we also want to make the end game for all of us is that homelessness is rare, brief, and one time. And so again, on the slide, if you've been in this series, this is a slide you've seen. People in a housing crisis need to have a place to go. We want to really work to make sure that people are not unsheltered. We also want to make sure that people are not homeless for long periods of time, so that we want to make sure that people, when they become homeless, are quickly connected to housing and don't recycle back into the system. So at the front door, it's rare, right? We do as much diversion as we can. We try to stop, really work on the inflow. And then if somebody comes in the system, we want it to be brief, and we don't want people to be cycling through our system multiple times. And so really one of the important things then is really looking at our system performance measures. And the really important part is that this is all of us together. And these measures, whether you get, a lot of emergency shelters may not get any federal funding at all. You certainly don't get continuum care funding in many cases unless you provide programs outside of the emergency shelter. And some of you may get some emergency shelter grant money, but a lot of shelters are run completely with donor dollars, fundraising dollars. And sometimes it can feel like, well, we're not really part of that larger thing that's happening out there. But reality is that everything that happens in an emergency shelter impacts our system performance and impacts the ability of our communities to bring like federal funds and funds in, because we are measuring how we reduce the inflow of homelessness. We also look at how do we increase access to permanent housing? And emergency shelters have a huge impact on that. Shelters also have a huge impact on decreasing the average length that people are homeless, and as well, the decrease in returns to homelessness. So shelters play such a critical part of the entire system flow in our systems. And that's the piece we really want to focus on today. Here are all the system interventions. And we've talked about street outreach. We've talked about homelessness prevention. We've talked about diversion and problem solving. We talked about coordinated entry last month. And now we're on to really talk about emergency shelter. And so across all the systems, this is all connected, right? Street outreach really needs to have effective emergency shelter to do their jobs, right? Diversion can also be part of what we do in emergency shelter. When people come to our shelters, what kinds of conversations are we having with problem-solving conversation? Coordinated entry needs to have a place for folks to go to. So emergency shelter is a huge part of this entire system. And everything across our system. And I said this earlier, housing first is a critical component, and we all have to be focused on that model and really that belief in that folks are ready for housing and can be housed. We have to be data driven, right? We can tell a lot of our anecdotal stories, but the reality is that data is going to tell us whether we're effective or not. And that's not just our own data, but our system data. Right. So system data, the effectiveness of all of our interventions will show in our access to permanent housing. It will show in reductions in our length of stay. It's going to show in the decreases back into homelessness. And equity across the board, everything has to be based in equity to make sure that we have an equitable system that everyone can get the services that they need. And one of the most important things is system flow. And I'm going to just say this. I live in Florida, and where I live, we have a ton of roundabouts, right? And I think I said this in the last webinar I did in this series, is that we have a season. A lot of you may know that. And, for us, we call it like, the snowbirds or the seasonal folks that come down during the winter months. And often those folks are not used to the roundabouts, right? Most of us that live there have gotten used to the roundabouts. And so typically you get to a roundabout, you know how you watch, you quickly enter it, you keep the system flowing. And what we've learned is that when people are not understanding of how a roundabout works, they get to the roundabout and slam on their brakes and just don't go into that. They just get nervous. They don't want to go in. And then suddenly this traffic just backs up. So when when the roundabout and that flow gets backed up with 1 car, 2 cars, 3 cars, it's going to impact the entire traffic flow miles back. That's the way to think about a system, is each program, each component, and each program is part of that system. It is, if even one program gets backed up or one component in the system is not connecting and flowing with the other components, the entire system can get backed up. So constantly be thinking about, how do we add to our system flow so that people can come into the system but leave the system quickly, and that we don't have this pile up at the front door of the system and unsheltered people and lots of waiting lists, which are often symptoms of ineffective system flow. And so again, if we make investments just sort of randomly and we don't look at our system, we don't look at our interventions, this is sort of the way it can look like. It's a hot mess, right? But when we start really flowing and start working together, what we can have is a system. And if I can do this, it can actually, that works like this, right? It works efficiently and people can flow through the system and flow out. And so what we really want to talk about is then, how does emergency shelter make this happen? So today we're going to talk about effective emergency shelter, and really about how do we think about our shelter as a housing focused place that people want to use. And I'm going to be turning this over to Nichelle Carver. Nichelle Carver works for USICH. I first got to know Nichelle when I first started the Alliance quite a few years back. I think it was probably 12 or 13 years ago. And I was doing work in Virginia, and Nichelle at that time worked for the DHCD, Department of Housing and Economic Development, for the state of Virginia. And so Michelle and I have done a lot of time together. We did a lot of work together and really looking at emergency shelters, what makes shelter effective, and how shelter can be part of that system flow. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nichelle, who is going to moderate our session today, keep this roundtable discussion going, and she will then introduce you all of your panelists to all of you. Nichelle?
Thank you, Kay. Hi, everyone. As Kay said, my name is Nichelle Carver. I'm one of the senior regional advisors with the National Initiatives team at the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, or some people know it as USICH or USICH, which is odd, but I've heard that. And then I'm based right outside of Richmond, Virginia, but I serve all of New England and the states of New York, New Jersey, and I'm also working on a White House project in Dallas called All Inside, which is not in New York, New Jersey, or New England, but here we are. And if you're in one of the states I serve, please, if we haven't talked yet, hit me up. Either visit usich.gov's website or stay till the end. That's a plug. And my info will be on the slide at the end. So as Kay kind of laid out the whole system and how the system should operate, I really do want to kind of focus, like eagle eye, our efforts on talking about shelters today. And an effective shelter should embrace the housing first approach. There should be immediate and low barrier access to anybody facing a housing crisis, and they're unable to avoid it through that problem solving conversation, right? The staff should constantly be looking at it to see, are we doing well? Do we need to change? Are we getting to the people we need to get to? Kind of like Kay said, we want to make sure that if people are doing outreach, there's a low barrier shelter for people to go to. And I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows what Housing First is, like the approach is. But I'm going to do a quick refresher. It means that anybody can access shelter without prerequisites. So no sobriety requirements, no income requirements. You don't have to have a 650 credit score. You know what I'm saying? You just get to come in the door. And it also should be open 24/7 because life kind of doesn't shut down at 7:30. Like it just doesn't, especially crisis. I feel like every crisis I've ever had happens like after 9, more like midnight. So just thinking about making sure you have a place for people to go 24/7. And also when you have a shelter, the services that you offer should be voluntary, right? And it also should be related to accessing permanent housing. So say a bank in your area, and this is a true story, say a bank in your area wants to offer credit counseling and budgeting, right? Ask yourself, is this something that the guest residents have said they wanted? Like, have they requested that? Will it help them get into housing? Like, start just thinking, like, is this even going to do what we need it to do? Or will it be a waste of the bank and the residents' time? Because here's the reality is, you know, and everybody who's a Gen Xer knows this, is hard to make $1 out of 15 cents. So, like, no matter how much budgeting help you give somebody, if they have almost nothing, it's not going to do what they think it's going to do. So again, make sure that whatever services you have that are voluntary also will help further a person getting into permanent housing. The end goal of shelter is always going to be to get people off the street or out of homelessness, but your goal is to get them into permanent housing. Therefore, like, you know how shelters will have shelter expectations? And notice I didn't say rules because rules tend to have a negative connotation. Think about, for most of us, the last time rules were imposed upon us, we were kids. Like I was a kid. We're no longer kids, right? So conveying that message, you can do that without calling it rules. Rules are pretty punitive. And your expectations should really center on keeping your guests, your staff, your visitors safe. And around like just the work to support people getting into permanent housing. So you hear like that's a theme. What can you do as an emergency shelter to help move folks into a permanent housing place? And Housing First shelter expectations also should contribute to a low barrier environment. I want to be clear when I say this, because if you have shelters in your communities that have empty beds or people sleeping outside and people are still sleeping outside, take a step back and ask yourself why. Like, not in a defensive way, like they don't want to follow rules or they want to sleep outside, because I know everybody on here has heard those kind of things. I'm talking about, think about it in a compassionate, empathetic way. Like, if I were experiencing homelessness and no shelter had a place for Shadow Joyanne Carver, that's my fur daughter, well, we staying outside. We're staying in the car. I'm not leaving my child, my fur child, to go anywhere, right? And so the reality is, if you have a shelter and somebody can't bring their family, because pets are family, especially when you have nothing else, you have to think about, what are you asking that person to give up? And would you give up your pet to go somewhere? I'm just saying, I would not. And I can say that 100%. I stand on business on that one. So, and also if you have like a substance use disorder, or if I had one and I'm trying to get in the shelter and they're saying, you got to give us a clean urine before you can get in the shelter. That means I got to figure out how to detox and then get in the shelter. And if I could figure out how to detox, I probably might not be struggling with substance use disorder, right? So my whole point is, think really hard about your system, specifically your shelter, and really listen to the people who are about to speak. Take notes, see if there's something that you could take back and change today. Like, what am I going to get from this? Try to stay very focused, because I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I'm on webinars and I'm doing like 50 different things. This is one of those really important webinars where the people we serve need us to pay attention, learn, and do better. And I'm saying all of us, not just the people who need to, but all of us can always learn something else. So with that, I want to start by passing it over to Michelle Condorino. And Michelle is going to tell you who she is and all about herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Actually, this is probably one of my favorite topics. As Nichelle said, my name is Michelle Condorino. I am the executive director of Open Doors in Norwalk, Connecticut. I have been the executive director here for 5 years, but I have about a 20-year career in homeless services. I started as a street outreach worker and worked my way up over time. And, when I first arrived at Open Doors, launched really into reforming the shelter into a housing first, low barrier model. And so I'm really excited to share that journey with all of you today.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. And next, we're going to have Jonathan Russell.
Sorry. Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Russell, and I am the Director of Housing and Homelessness for Alameda County in the Bay Area of California, home to Oakland, which some of which you can see behind me here. I also have been in this work for a minute, originally similarly doing advocacy, outreach, shelter work on Skid Row in Los Angeles, where I'm from, for many years. More recently here in the Bay. Prior to this role, I was working as the Chief Strategy Officer after a long time working in operations at a large Bay Area nonprofit called BACS, where we did interim housing, VSH, about everything. So very excited about this conversation, very passionate about developing and supporting models that are people-centered in this work and shelters that contribute to housing, not function as warehousing. So yeah, glad to be here and look forward to chatting.
Thank you, Jonathan. And next, I want to introduce Mary Beth Matthews Atkins.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Beth Atkins. I am the executive director of an agency called Family Crisis Support Services, and we are located in the far southwest corner of Virginia, most commonly referred to as Appalachia. And Family Crisis is a dual shelter in that all those system interventions that Kay had listed, we offer that under one roof. But I also provide services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking that are included with our services here, and also services to the people in the region living in poverty. I've been doing this work for January will be 13 years. And I had the privilege of working under Nichelle as one of her agencies back when she worked for the Department of Housing and Community Development. And she taught me a lot.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Don't get me all weepy. I don't want to do that today. All right. So lastly, but not least, we have John DeCarmine, and he'll introduce himself. Take it away, John.
Hey, y'all. Yeah, my name is John DeCarmine. I'm the executive director of a program called Grace in Gainesville, Florida. We're a 140-bed low barrier shelter that is actually, we took over a former prison campus. So we've got this enormous campus. We've got 23 acres. So we do both extreme low barrier shelter for men, women, couples, and veterans. We are also a drop-in center and a one-stop center for unsheltered folks. So we're serving 300 or 400 people per day, including the 140 in shelter, with everything from meals and computers and clothes and kind of the basic needs stuff. And then all of our effort is really focused on getting people into housing as quickly as possible. We operate permanent supportive housing and street outreach as well, which also really makes it easier to do low barrier services. And there's a strong connection between our outreach team and our shelter. And just to kind of get us started, I know when we were starting to consider going low barrier about 10 years ago, it was so overwhelming and so intimidating. And so as you're hearing all of the suggestions and advice today from folks who have done this work, I would ask that you kind of think of the idea of lowering barriers as harm reduction. The same way that I think by now we're all used to celebrating that if somebody was drinking 20 beers and now they're drinking 2, we're not just judging them for drinking 2 beers. We're saying, way to go, that's awesome, you've done it. We can do the same thing with ourselves and give ourselves some of that grace to know that we don't have to get this down perfectly in order to start making really substantial impacts for the people that we have the honor of serving.
Thank you so much, John. So we're going to move into a phase of question and answer. And I am really excited to have the point of privilege to be able to ask these questions, because there are things that, gosh, I wish I had asked and known 12 years ago, back when we were doing funding. So without further ado, so one of the questions I have, and I'll start with Mary Beth. So unsheltered homelessness is increasing, and in places where the shelter beds are open, kind of like what I talked about. Why don't people want to use certain beds? You know you muted, Mary Beth, for real.
You knew I'd do that. I will tell you when I look, so for the last couple of years, I have followed the data on people not coming into shelter and using those beds. Big thing, they're animal. And so if you cannot offer a shelter that offers the space for, that 4-legged child, people will sleep in their cars. And I understand that. Plus, I think there is a misconception on shelter. People think there's always going to be rules and regulations. And, in the 12 years that I've been doing this, we have gone from having those rules and regulations while in shelter to being an extremely low barrier shelter. I think community living for some people is hard at best. They could have some form of trauma, or you have those that have untreated mental health that, just being in that community living, they think there's no privacy. The anxiety of having a lot of people around them, I think are, some big reasons. And like you said about, those who are alcoholics, who have drug addictions, being in shelter and not being able to do that. And it's not that you promote that, but you need to be accepting that people have issues, and we just need to make sure that they are housed and off the streets and safe. And sometimes I think some people don't want to come into shelter because it doesn't seem like a safe environment. For us here at our shelter, we are 24 hours. There's always staff on site, and I am finally getting ready to build a pet facility. So we'll talk about that when I answer the funding question. So we're doing our best to, take the quantitative and the quality data that is out there and bring those services and just offer all those system interventions under one roof. And so that, we can not treat it, but we can provide it under one roof.
Thanks, Mary Beth. And Jonathan, same question. Just, why don't people want to come into the shelter when shelter beds are open and you have unsheltered homelessness?
Yeah, thanks for that, and appreciate what Mary Beth said. I think that the pets piece is huge. All the programs that I used to, when we always joke that this is an interspecies interim housing, right? Like, we have to create a space. I mean, we have cockatoos, and that's a really important piece. I think sort of quickly, I think there's an important meta point here, because I think that this often gets used in the category of sort of shoring up this, I think, wrong category of service resistance, right? It's like, well, people don't want to access it. This is the like paradigm of the service resistance. And I like to use an analogy to kind of signal how odd this is that we think that this is an example of that. Like, right, if I made a product for 20 years and people didn't want to buy it, right, and I kept, you know, either underfunding it or I kept it the same, and then no one was buying that product, no one would be like, man, there's just something wrong with those people out there in the world. They're product resistant, right? Like, this is that people, the number one principle here, I think, of treating human beings like human beings is when you treat people like people, you know, they know how to best meet their needs. And if they're not accessing a resource, that's because it doesn't meet their needs, right? So I just think it's important, like framing device, to say, oftentimes people aren't accessing shelter because it's not meeting their needs. And so we need to create, and folks know their needs, right? That's the bigger point. We often think, well, they're not accessing it because, you know, they don't know what's best for them and this is the right thing. So there's just this framing device that I think is very important to say. That is very often what's going on, right? So from my perspective, I think, you know, the more we create environments, and again, as a longtime provider, operator, now system administrator, full disclosure, I've only worked in the government for a couple months, so I'm new to that, but I think we often create and sort of promulgate these expectations, but we don't fund them right. So this isn't just like providers and shelter developers, you know, not wanting to do the right thing. It's not being resourced to create the product that people want and need. So I think that this is more of a system problem than sort of an individual's not using the thing that we know is best for them. They just haven't access to it.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'm a 25-year government person. I love it. Love it. Nobody says that, but I feel it in my heart. So, and I agree, we have not really worked on the system. Some parts of it is still the same as when I started in 1997. Ridiculous. All right. So I do want to kind of move the conversation a little bit. So to talk about, like, how would somebody out there who has a shelter that may not be quite low barrier yet? So I want to just ask a couple of questions around how to get in that space of even starting that. I want to start with Mary Beth, just because then I'll be able to move into the group, but some of this I know, so it's really exciting. But Mary Beth, where does the shelter start with working on being safe, welcoming, and like a housing focused space?
So I think it is that point of entry. It is that point of contact when someone is first looking, reaching out for the services, or having a successful coordinated entry program. And you know, when we were talking here a second ago, I was like, you know, that first line of meeting somebody at the shelter, coming into shelter, talking to somebody on that telephone is so important. So as a dual agency, we take a trauma-informed approach and a housing focused first approach, just because of the dual shelter role that we play. And I have found, you know, even if I was one or the other, the combination of having that focus is so important, and you get a lot further with the people that you're serving. And, you know, just a welcoming, inclusive type setting. And here's the thing, it's not easy. You know, becoming a low barrier shelter. I remember the first time I heard Kay talk, I was like, and she was promoting this low barrier shelter. And I thought, absolutely not. I will have a major party going on. I mean, it just floored me. And I got to tell you, you know, we took small steps in getting there. And, you know, getting your staff also to change to a low barrier. We're not jail. These are grown adults that we need to treat with respect, and we need to be welcoming and inclusive. And it's possible, because I will tell you, you know, the staff that I have here has been here through the years with me. And we went from a very structured emergency shelter to an extremely low barrier shelter. And it has been successful. So you can do it. and for me, it was doing it in steps. It wasn't like, okay, here's the free for all, here's the party, come in when you want, there's no rules. There was putting the resources in place. It was putting the case management and supportive services while they were here. And it was just the whole environment of emergency shelter.
Thanks, Mary Beth. And so along that same line of like, because you mentioned a couple of things and said you got to take baby steps because it was a lot. Michelle, I want to ask you, like, what were your initial or your ongoing challenges when you were starting to implement like a safe housing focused low barrier shelter?
Yeah, I think, I really want to call out that, so many of us have amazing teams, right? And often they're not included in the policy creations and in identifying what is the challenge, right? Sometimes we can identify an incident or behavior we don't like, but the staff are so amazing at helping to identify why is that behavior happening, right? And so for us, it was really about, okay, we have all of these policies and procedures. We had a client handbook that was like 10 pages long. I'm like, who's reading this? Right? Like, have any of you read this? Right? None of the staff have fully read it. Why do we anticipate that our shelter guests are going to read this as well? So we really started with like a basic principle. And for me, it's that people come to shelter because they're in the worst moment of their life. We are here because we applied for a job and and we agreed to a contract. So let's adjust expectations of respectful behavior, that it starts with us. We have to treat people as if they are our customer because they are. They are the reason we exist. And so if we start there, how do we look at the policies and procedures we have through fresh eyes? And really saying to ourselves, I used to say to the team, I'm not looking for 100% compliance from every single person who walks through the door. I'm looking for 70% compliance across the board. Shelter is not about tonight. Shelter is about tomorrow, right? It's not to be a perfect shelter resident. It is to have a space that is safe and respectful for everyone while people are in the pursuit of housing. And if we think about everything we do through that lens, a lot of our decisions are going to be a lot easier. And that rules are not concrete. Rules are guidelines. There's always going to be flow. And think about yourself, right? If I were the person requesting this exemption or that, how would I want to be treated? I certainly wouldn't want the door slammed in my face because curfew is at this time and you're 5 minutes late and you knew. Well, haven't we all not been late in our lives? I mean, why do we have to they have to live by a set of rules that the rest of us don't have to live by? So I think the more we humanize this work, we allow staff to have some autonomy within those guidelines to make decisions, set our values and ensure that our work is reflective of our values. This work becomes so much easier. Every rule is a space for conflict. So the more rules you have, I think people think the more rules I have, the more structured this environment is going to be. It never works that way. The more rules you have, the more space you have for conflict. So let's try to get these rules down to safety, respect, and housing focused. And once we do that, it's actually amazing, the changes that we had. And so, sure, there's some resistance there, right? There's always going to be resistance to change. People have been doing things. It was comfortable for them. Maybe they felt a little bit more in power because, because they had all these rules and they were the authority. But at the end of the day, we are here for one purpose, right? To shelter people until they can get into permanent housing. And anything we do that forces us to consistently discharge people is not facilitating that goal.
Thank you so much. And John, I want to ask you kind of the same thing. What were some initial or ongoing challenges? And just like Michelle talked about staff, like if you had anything that you had to work through with your staff, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. So I think I loved what Michelle said. And I just want to follow up on one piece where we're also looking for 75% compliance on most things, but 100% compliance when it comes to things like violence or theft or harassment. Like, if you can't not have a drink, then you're going to go sneak a beer behind the building. And I'm going to ask you, hey, listen, we don't allow that here. Would you mind either taking that off campus or pouring it out? Nobody ever pours it out. And we may have to have that conversation 3 or 4 or 5 times. If we have it 27 times, which is and not the upper limit on conversations we've had with people, we may have to start talking about some other opportunities for that person that don't look like shelter, where maybe if they do need to use all night, then you know what? We can work with them with our outreach team, and we can work with them. We're still not cutting them out from the service system. We're saying you might not do well living in a congregate setting with 139 other people who are in crisis. So for us, the big changes, I'd say the hardest part for us was staff. And I work with shelters around the country. So when we went low barrier, we had only been in existence for 2 years, and we were pretty low barrier to start with. Like, we started with this perspective of like, holy cow, we've had high barrier shelters in our community for decades, and we're trying to get funding for our own low barrier shelter. And when you look at our housing inventory charts, it shows that we're only using half of the shelter beds that we have in the community, because you had to pray before you ate, you had to pay to stay there, and you had to take a breathalyzer every time you went in and out of the building. But we're going and saying, hey, we have this idea, we need to start something new. And our funders, potential funders, are saying, what are you talking about? You have 50% availability in your shelter beds. So we didn't have to make a lot of changes, but with a lot of the shelters that I've worked with, who have been in existence for a long time, the biggest thing you got to change is staff. Like, figuring out how to accommodate animals isn't really that difficult. And it's actually easier to get money for homeless pets than it is to get money for homeless people half of the time, all of the time. So we can get money for housing for people with pets easier than we can get housing for people without pets sometimes. Working with staff and being okay with the fact that some staff are not going to make it in a low barrier shelter was another part of it. We had to really cheerlead for the idea that ending homelessness is possible. And a lot of people had a lot of direct experience working in high barrier shelters that just said, no, we're just going to keep this guy in shelter for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And as long as he's nice to everybody, we're going to call that a win. Well, I don't know who that's actually a win for. When we're talking about how we can be compassionate and respectful, it seems to me one of the most respectful things we could do is not have somebody endure living in a homeless shelter for 5 straight years. I don't know that I answered your question, Michelle. I'm sorry. I got excited about what Michelle had said. But for us, it was the easy changes are out there. I saw some of the questions people had posted in advance of this webinar, and there were questions about like, what do we do for couples when they come in? I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but you could just let them in. Our co-ed shelter is just a place where men and women stay together. They don't even, sometimes the beds are near each other, sometimes they're not, but they're in the same building. And that goes to, if you think about the direct relationship between the quality of emergency shelters and what you're seeing out on the street in terms of unsheltered homelessness, pets and partners are the 2 big things that people show up, and you get to make a decision. They can come in and say, hey, I'm in this big, scary place with my wife. And we say, awesome. Now you go over this side of the place and you go over here. And they say, you know what? Thanks, but no thanks. I'll go stay in the woods with the person I trust and who will protect me. The same thing with pets. We can say, you can bring your animal in, and we can say you can't bring your animal in, but one of those is going to allow us to work with somebody to get them off the street. One of them is going to send them back out into the woods, and maybe they'll come back, but they're almost guaranteed to be worse off if they've lived outside for a year before coming back.
Thank you so much. And I do have full disclosure. I would not go in if they separated me from my husband either. I did not say that, but we talked about my dog. You know, just in case he ever sees this any day in his life, I don't want him to think me and Shadow would leave him. We would not. So I do want to.
Can I just make one point
I was
on
going
this
to
that
ask
I
you,
feel like
Jonathan. Yep, go ahead.
Michelle and John have like nailed this so well, but like the summary of like this idea that low barrier is harder, right? That it's harder to do it, that it's harder to like, it's a lot harder to build a wall than not have one in the first place, right? Like there is something, so I think not to paper over the complexities of going through a transition is one thing, but low barrier as such is not necessarily harder. It's harder to work against the grain of human dignity and self-determination by enforcing constraints and rules, right? I mean, that is, I think, one of the things that's really important to lift up is building a more relational model works better together with what we are as humans that want to be treated as humans and have relationships and connect, right? So I think that that's just, it's important to frame that this is harder. It's hard to transition from anything, but low barrier as such is not by definition more difficult. In fact, as Michelle described so well, all these things we add that we think are creating safety and creating the kind of structure we need actually take a lot more work. And I think when you go through these transitions and work with folks and staff and realize empowering models are easier for us too, because we get to act like human beings, right? And not just point to the rules on the wall, which it's so easy to go to in like crisis and concern to be like, boom, let's get the rules up. That's always my litmus test to having open programs and then like not been the operator and like going back 6 or 8 months later, like, oh, I'm gonna go check in on the Hayward Navigation Center. I'm like, someone pasted like a rule on the wall. Something's off in our philosophy here because we're collapsing back into something that we need to sort of speak to what's fundamental here. So I think that's really important to like combat this idea that they're by definition harder to be low barrier. Oftentimes it can be the opposite.
And I also think you're trying to tell a grown adult, okay, this is a rule. And how demeaning is that when you're telling a grown adult, okay, while you're here, you have to be in at such and such
100%.
time. Well, if they were in permanent housing of their own, there is nobody there telling them that. So a housing first approach is not giving them the rules and restrictions.
Mary Beth, you're absolutely right. And when we train on that, we talk, the example we always give is like, how would you expect a 65-year-old man to respond when my 20-year-old staff member is telling him about his bedtime?
Okay, that was a perfect example of like the problems that we have in our shelters. And again, 30 years ago, I remember telling a family, a mom with 3 kids, how she needed parenting. I had not kid the first. I was 22 and I'm like, no, if you're going to stay here at this shelter, you're going to have to do these parenting classes. And I remember her clearly looking at me and saying, what the hell do you know about parenting? And I was like, well, I have a degree. But I mean, it was that level of like, now that I think back, I wish somebody would tell me, who has 2 grown children, how to do that. And I think we just created this weird power dynamic that I'm glad no longer exists. I do want to ask Jonathan, I want to ask you a question because you've kind of transitioned into a different space, but it sounds like you had a pretty good shelter environment with your staff. How did you bring them along? Like, was it that they were already in that mindset? Or did you have to bring them to a place? Or did you have staff turnover and have to start over?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above, right? Sorry, I'm caught up in just there's a hot chat going on over here. I was in the chat. So previous to working in the government, which I love to, I probably need to get the masterclass from you, Michelle, to just like figure out how to keep me here. I'm still learning how different it is to be that than a provider. But so I was really fortunate to get to launch some programs that by definition, we like started with, so I think we opened while I was at Bax, 5 different shelters, new shelters in new communities and some in existing communities. And we were really fortunate to be from the jump, like, here's our model, here's what it's going to cost, and here's how it works. We were not, so we were really able to start from the beginning. In one community in Monterey County, we were opening a new model that was new to low barrier was new to the community as such, right? There was a host of shelters around, and there was some shelters that were closing, unfortunately, for this one to open, or while this one was opening. So we brought our model, that built on a lot of these same principles, and we hired locally a lot of folks in the community that were coming from very, I'll call them old school, high barrier, more paternalistic, you leave in the morning. Ultimately, I think we should say, because we got to talk about the structural issues, underfunded and therefore operating that way, right? It's like people don't bring a desire to be inhuman in the way they operate. Scarcity and funding often has created shelters what they are. I think that's a side note to say that's really important. But we had this really unique experience of trying to sort of open a new model with folks that had worked in shelter environments that were very different, and to try to change that mentality. And fundamentally, I think what was helpful for us is that it was about centering relationships, not rules. Moving from transaction to relationship as the core metaphor, the core sort of motto through which we operated. And that was, I think, what helped us to sort of, in some ways, and I don't want to be too like mushy about it, but it allowed our staff to actually bring their whole selves to work, that we wanted them to interact with the folks we were serving, like their neighbors, like their friends, like coworkers in other environments, not sort of think of themselves as enforcers of rules, right? And so having a more relational model where we saw it change was, I would always do our trainings in terms of distinguishing safety from control, right? Establishing safety is not the same thing as enforcing control. Those are 2 very different things. And so for us, it was, for sure, there were some people that just, it wasn't their bag. They weren't down for it, right? They didn't want to stick in there. And so they didn't work with us. But the vast majority of people, as soon as they started to have their own experience of, oh, this is better, this is easier, I don't feel a sense of like moral injury in the way that I have to treat this person. And it's just like, my job's better by treating Sherry like an adult like me, and like Sherry and I get along better, and like this is great, and things are moving forward. It's the experience of the improved like relationship of the new model. And no doubt we have to constantly come back to it, like harm reduction, moving that from a concept to practice, right? Is huge. But it was this continual culture setting versus training that we had to constantly do. And I mean, I will say those programs that do it, like, I don't think you can experience it and like go back, like a lot of folks reflect back and they're like, wait a second, this is way better. My job is better, let alone the folks we're serving is better by getting to operate this way.
And okay, so all of this, and this from everything you guys have said, sounds great. But what I keep hearing, and I just heard this in Ithaca, New York, it's so expensive. It's so expensive. It's going to be expensive to have low barrier shelter. It's going to be really expensive. I mean, that was the number one thing, was their rationale. Mary Beth, I want to just pull you in here for a second to talk about how you even pay for this. Like, first of all, is it as expensive? And I would love for all of you to chime in on that one. But if it is a little bit more expensive, how you pay for it? Like, where are you getting the extra money from? Because government is not they're not giving. So what are you doing to make that happen?
It's a lot of level funding at the time. So I operate 3 thrift stores where donated clothing comes in. That helps with some of the basic need costs, which are usually not part of your state or federal grants. They help with rent, utilities, and things like that. But those basic needs of food, shampoo, conditioner, soap are not in there. I think it's being creative, looking at your local foundations for funding. We're all on the internet. I mean, finding the resources. I mean, so I'm just going to say this. So I just built a brand new shelter. It took me 3.5 years. And in the middle of my project, I was probably about $1.5 million short. And I found it. And it doesn't cost any more to operate this shelter, being extremely low barrier, as opposed to having rules and regulations. I mean, I think you just find the funding sources, but I disagree with that. I don't think it's more expensive to, I don't think it's more expensive to fund. I mean, I think you're just creating more problems when you put those kind of restrictions and think that thinking that high barriers and rules and restrictions work. No, I don't agree.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I would love for other people to jump in. Number one, with your experience of, is it more expensive? And also how you paying for it regardless.
I'll kick off. I totally agree. I don't actually see how it could be more expensive to do like to have less rules, right? Rules don't cost money. I think what's really where I think people center in is, well, I'll have to train staff. Yeah, you do. You do have to train your staff. I think so many times we want to be treated like professionals, but we don't want to act like it. There is so much free training available that, I think that excuse to me, I hear that one the most, it is really frustrating because, there are so many opportunities to learn, to engage, to improve, to lean on staff who are really doing the right thing and let them train, their own team members to cross agency train and to support. So I think that's a lot, and I want to say too, that work culture is such a huge component to a successful shelter, because this work is hard enough. And if we're not supporting our teams, and again, that means training them appropriately, that means giving them a little leeway, right? Same way with, like, if you're 5 minutes late, coming in and it's curfew time and you can't come in, if the bus is running 5 minutes late and they get in 5 minutes late, like, yeah, like, hopefully that's not every day, but giving those small allowances really builds a team. And I think, I can speak, I'm in one of probably the most expensive places you can be in this country, in Fairfield County. People are all working multiple jobs. And so sometimes we have to just take that into account and build that, because, the more people feel stressed by their employer, the worse they're going to treat clients. And so, we want to create an environment that the staff feels supported so that they can support others. And when you do those things, your programs run so much easier. And I actually think it's cheaper, because then you're not dealing with employment issues and unemployment and, people out on leaves and all of those things. Like, all that stuff goes away because your team feels supported, the clientele you're serving feels supported. And you can really just focus on your mission. So yeah, so I'm not sure where the expense would be in anywhere else, but.
Well,
And
and
Michelle, don't you think that, I think your collaborations with other agencies in your community are an important factor in this, as far as funding, because
Yes.
you need those paraprofessionals, you need your churches, you need your government, your local governments, so having successful relationships with those people in your community, and, seeking resources from those agencies are very, very beneficial to emergency shelters.
Yes.
I want to add a couple things there. So first, yeah, if you are making any additional investments in this, it has to go directly to your staff. And it's not just training, it's PTO. It is pay, so that your staff are not waiting in the same line as your guests trying to get their food stamp application in. Like, this is a trained professional service that we're providing, and it should be paid and treated as such. But to go a little bit contrarian here too, though, I mean, and I think Jonathan's got me in an analogy mood after that epic analogy earlier. You know, everybody always says that they want nonprofits to run like businesses. But if I have somebody come and build a fence around my house, and I agreed that I was going to get a 1 mile long fence, and then at the end of the day, I'm like, would you mind just adding 50% more? Would you add another half mile? They would say no, because that's what a business does. And yet we are always in these situations where we're dealing with homelessness that is directly caused by federal policy, directly caused by poor discharge planning at prisons, directly caused by poor discharge planning at hospitals. All of those things are funded so much better than we are. And yet we stand up and we're like, oh, you didn't do your job. You didn't do your job. You didn't do your job. I'll do 50% more work for no additional cost. That is not sustainable. And I think we have to also say that. We can't just be told again and again, like, hey, we said we'd give you $300,000 for this. Now we need you to do twice as much. We can't. We have to say that. Like, and when it comes to maintaining a safe environment, that also is tied to what your staff ratio is. And I'm not just talking about caseloads, but like, I'm running a 23-acre campus with no security, no cops, no metal detectors, 4 staff at a time, who are some of the most amazing people that you'll ever hope to meet. But they damn well better be trained, and they better be awesome, and they better be rested and well paid enough that they show up pretty excited to do the work, and not like be helping one guest look for a job while they're also looking for another job to work overnight before they come back for you.
100. I'm not going to use another analogy because that one was better than the first one. But I just like, not to pile on, well, to pile on to this point, I do think, and this might also be a little bit contrarian, is I do think we have to level set and say it does cost more than it currently does, right? But we also need to frame this in terms of community costs, not in terms of individual project cost, right? To have length of stay, right? If we're infusing a richer, more robust exit resources added, right? Like I always use the like, cut the security, add the security deposits, right? Like less security contract, more security deposits to help people exit. If we're funding better stay, like per year cost for a stay for an individual, because we're lowering the caseloads, because we're providing exit resources, that means that if we're producing a higher rate to permanent housing and shorter lengths of stay, that does cost less per person in the long run, right? And that costs the community less. So I think we have to tie in like the shelter cost question and level setting for sure. Like this is what robust support needs. We have to tie that into these larger costs, these larger arguments that we make about PSH and subsidies really well, which is like, well, it only costs $30,000 a year for a permanent voucher and $80,000 if they're bouncing through the PES system. Our shelters become contributors to that latter case if they're just having people there long-term and not exiting the housing, right? So some of this, like, I think that's incumbent upon us as funders to recognize that, right? Like I'm a new us, but I bring the experience, and I have seen, yep, here's the rate and here's the argument for your community of funding this well, what it's going to mean long-term. Less comps, less people bouncing in and out, less 2 years and nowhere to go for Joe. Joe's costs over those 2 years in a low-cost shelter are going to be way more expensive in the long run than an intensively supported, let's get him into housing in 4 or 5 months model.
And so I want to ask one last question before we get to some of the questions that have been coming in the chat fast and furious. So just asking you guys, like, one thing you'd want communities to know about the importance of lower barrier shelter, and also like, how do you measure if you're doing it right? So if you could put that into, just your last answer, and then we'll move into questions from the group. So we'll do it in the same order you guys started. So Michelle, then Jonathan, Mary Beth, John. I think that's how it went. All right, let's start.
One, I think, we'll kind of say like, you're successful when you've got to look at your data, right? So when we were not a low barrier shelter, our discharge to permanent housing was 57%. When we converted, now we're at 83% discharge to permanent housing. I also think you have to look at your discharge to unshelter. because so many shelters, you're looking like, why is their discharge to permanent housing so low? And then you look at their discharge to unshelter and that number is almost equal. I've seen that, right? 30% to housing or 30% to the streets. Well, that's why nobody wants to go there, because they probably already were there. And so, if you've got like large ban lists and huge discharges to unshelter, you're not performing the function of your role, right? And that's on the agency, not on the clients. Kind of going back, I think, to what Jonathan said at the front, it's like if we are trying to make people fit into our mold, that's not the approach that's going to see us actually get to an end of homelessness or to solve homelessness. And so I think really starting with your data, that's huge. And then temperature gauge, right? Employee satisfaction surveys, like please ask your staff and engage your staff in that. And then house meetings and client, satisfaction surveys, and, how can you gain the perspective of the people who are, utilizing your services, the people who are providing your services, to kind of give yourself a more holistic view.
Jonathan?
I'm gonna go after Michelle. What Michelle said, I think, again, outcomes, right? Like, but I the flip side of that, is have we resourced that environment to be able to achieve and increase those outcomes, right? So it's not just incumbent upon the little old shelter that's been getting 250 grand in ESG, which, well, at least in California, that's peanuts and not possible, right? For 10 years to be like, convert to low barrier and here's your 75% to permanent housing like threshold for performance. No, it's have we resorted in a way where we can see those outcomes? I would also just see like access and appreciation, right? Does the community experiencing homelessness access and appreciate this resource? Is it a trusted entity in the community, right? We do a lot of quantitative like data as system people, but I do think it's the people that are experiencing homelessness in the community would tell you if that's a valuable resource or not and whether it should be around. And that's an aggregate, right? That's not to say there's not complaints and stuff, but I think that real feedback from folks, if people are accessing and using it and feeling safe and cared for and, on the path, then that's the value. And I think we need to ask more of the people that utilize the resource more than just our HMIS systems about that piece too.
I think part of it too, we have to acknowledge what problem we're trying to solve in the beginning. And we're not always trying to solve the same problem as the people who fund us. We set up our shelter, our community invested $1 million a year in it, which is not peanuts in Florida, but it's still not a lot to run a 24/7 program on 23 acres. But what we found was we've met every single performance benchmark in the past 10 years. But the number one metric that our community uses to evaluate if they think we're working is whether or not they see a homeless guy on the street on the way to work. And so, we have to kind of acknowledge that sometimes success is that we're giving people opportunities to come in to receive services. So I'll be real transparent. We've never had an 80% exits to permanent housing rate in our CAPER reports. We have gotten as high as 50, 60%, and we still view that as a success because we're giving hundreds and hundreds more people the opportunity to come through shelter, to connect with any kind of resource for basic needs, for disabilities, for medical stuff. They're coming in for healthcare, they're coming in for all of these things, and we're building rapport and we're building relationships with them that may not be recognized or realized on your first or second or third or 15th time through shelter. There's always great medical room and heart attack analogies of, you don't show up and they're like, sorry, you've already had a heart attack, so we're not going to treat you again. I view, and I'm a recovering junkie myself, but like getting into housing and making the shelter work and having the opportunity to work with people in the shelter feels a lot like recovery for me, where most people don't show up to an AA meeting or an NA meeting and within 30 days they're clean or they're sober, and in my experience, it was like, cool, after 30 days, I was clean for 2 days or housed for 2 days, and then it fell apart. And then I went back and I tried again. And then I was housed for 15 days, or I was clean for 30 days. And then I was like, cool, I got this figured out. And I started doing the same stuff. We see the same exact thing in housing as we do in recovery, where it's reasonable to think that somebody is not going to undo 30 years of making the best bad choices they had available to them in the first 30-day length of stay that you establish. Like, it may take multiple times. So sometimes you know, the context and the qualitative part of that exits to permanent housing rate doesn't always capture the benefits that you're creating for the community or for the people that you're serving. And sometimes it takes a lot of work and kind of stewardship with the people funding you to recognize that there are multiple ways of looking at that data.
And I want to add, you know, when people come in to emergency shelter, that's the immediate critical need. And then, you know, we're talking about, you know, the qualitative data, but what about just, we're talking about dealing with someone and what kind of housing systemic intervention we're going to use. But what if they're hungry? You know, I think having that well-rounded of, you know, addressing if they're hungry first, or when was the last time they ate, or if they don't have a coat on, if they're cold, or if they don't have shoes, before we start this, you know, okay, so what is let's talk about going into emergency. So what options are available to you? And I think also important is strong prevention work in what we do. You know, I mean, we haven't really touched a whole lot on prevention, but, you know, having that strong prevention programs implemented in your community, you know, can be very helpful in, you know, the intervention services of those we serve. But I think we also got to remember, we have to address that basic human need first before, you know, sometimes we're throwing out all this other stuff. Because if you're talking to them about housing and shelter and they haven't eaten in 3 days, they're not hearing a word you say.
So we're going to move into the questions from the audience, and there's a lot of y'all out there. So one thing that keeps popping up, and I was looking at the chat and I'm like trying to follow, is what do you do? Because there's not enough affordable housing, right? We know that, like, we know everybody on this webinar knows there's not enough affordable housing. And we also know we can't build shelter our way out of that problem, right? That requires a whole different animal, but you can do both. And like, you can figure out how to have, you know, shelter that's housing first and be fighting like hell to get some housing built, right? But I can remember in 2013, Kay and I were somewhere, I don't know where, Kay, and people were like, "It's no housing." It was Northern Virginia. It's no housing, it's no housing, it's no housing. And Kay said, so it's not going to be housing if you keep them in the shelter for 3 years. Like, that problem still will exist. So then we have to like move away from what are the traditional things. And I think somebody wrote in the chat, doubling up, like, you know, having people with multiple roommates. Like in Richmond, there's a lot of houses that have one room and people rent it out. Like, it's got to be creative, because y'all, I'm a federal worker. America is, we work on, I'm not going to say kids, but we are all about profit, right? This is America. So we have to work within that system. And so how do you work within that system when you don't have housing? So I'm going to start with Jonathan. If you just want to share kind of, what do you do when there's no housing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I live in the East Bay, so there's plenty of housing here in California and our urban West Coast cities. So go ask someone else. No, I mean, I think, you know, as Mary Beth was talking, I think that's one of the things that, like, not to sound defensive of my fellow shelter peeps, but like, we can only hold shelters accountable for outcomes to the degree that we have built a structural context where there's a place to go, right? And this is where, I mean, I'll be real, I'm sure there's probably some Californians on the call right now, right? There is an all-out pitting shelter against permanent housing in California right now, between, you know, sort of electeds and budgeting and in our major budget crunches. Like, there is like there is unfortunately a really sort of zero-sum game, race to the bottom. We need sanctioned, safe sleeping versus permanent housing because that takes so long to build. Like that's a lot of, unfortunately, some of our elected officials conversation going on. And I think what you do is you realize that you can't build your way out of the homelessness crisis alone, right? I do think there's kind of this builder's fault of, there are a lot of people that enter and exit homelessness without our system resources, right? And that's because most of the factors that cause falling into homelessness are relational fractures, right? Of course, in income and all the structural things, and the solutions are a place to go back. So, I mean, we managed to keep a housing rate of 75+% to permanent housing in the East Bay, right? To Michelle, I mean, Michelle's been off the hook, right? To have that before you were even low barrier and housing focused. Now those shelters are costly, but a huge amount of the people we support are those flexible exits that aren't just to the forthcoming permanent voucher that you have on the new unit that got built 3 blocks away. We're never going to have enough of those timeline-wise to house everyone at the rate we need to. So having a pot of flexible funds to support all the diverse pathways of exit folks might, leave their homelessness with. A lot of people going into shared housing, right? Supporting that process. A lot of people reunifying family in a deeply permanent way, but using our flexible funds to provide what's needed to make that relationship connection be possible. So I think part of this is like, housing is the solution to homelessness, but the way we've framed housing sometimes as a system is very, very isolated to one kind, which is 1 to a unit, everybody's studio over there. And that's not what housing means in many communities. And there's a lot more diverse ways to support people exiting their current homelessness than that voucher being forthcoming. So I think that's a little, we have reified ourselves into rapid rehousing or PSH. If we don't have either of those interventions, then we can't support a resolution here. And so shelters that get a flexible bucket of funding to support all these diverse ways, I think that's how you do it. That's the scrappy way that you still get that rate and you support people, right? I mean, I always use a statistic in the Bay. It's like, we can't think it in our coordinated entry system. Over 27% of the people in my county, Alameda County, in our last point in time count, we just got our new one, but we don't have the survey data yet, said that a dispute with a family member or a roommate, right, was the primary reason they fell into homelessness. None of our interventions address that, right? It's like it's invisible to our sort of coordinated entry and investments. I talk to people about that, and the primary response I often get was, well, it's probably toxic and terrible, and they should have never been in it, right? So again, we're pathologizing people and think like, no, that could just be an economic issue, that if we could support resolution, that person could be back there. So I think, long way to say, like, housing is more diverse than we frame it. Exiting homelessness can be done with more creative resources than we often frame it. And that, I think, is the way you do it, especially in high cost housing markets, while we keep advocating and building new housing units.
In our community, and we also don't have affordable housing. I think the most recent data I saw says that for every 100 renters looking for a unit at 30% or less of AMI, there are 23 units available. So there's 4 people looking for every unit. What's worked well for us, 2 things. One, when we do fundraising, we only raise our total budget's $5 million a year, and that is 2.5 for the shelter. All of our government grants cover things like utility bills and staffing and all of the unsexy parts of running a shelter. And then we build we call it our housing slush fund. And sometimes it's $150,000. Right now it's $1,700. And it's only if you've got a pet that we can use it. But when you're pitching to donors, like what impact you can have with the money that they're going to give you, like, don't tell them you're going to pay the utility bill. Don't tell them that you're going to pay for 0.43 FTEs of a case manager. Tell them that for $250 in your diversion program, they can freaking end somebody's homelessness. Or for $2,800, they can pay first and last and security deposit for somebody moving out of homelessness and into housing. And we can pitch the things that are sexy about what we do to our donors in a way that gets them really, really excited about it. And then kind of also in keeping with the fundraising part, we steward our landlords the same way I steward my major donors. And we have an on-call phone for our landlords that we use, like they can call us 24/7 and we're going to answer the phone. So they know that when we're putting somebody in there, like the reality is they're always putting people with problems into their units. But they don't know that before it starts. And if we're putting somebody in and we say, hey, we would be happy to help with that, we'd be happy to use our maintenance guys to go over and fix that. I don't know what it is about people recently moved into housing, but there is this like pipeline from newly housed to I left my keys inside, and the first thing I can think of to get inside is to punch through the window to go grab my keys. And it has happened again and again and again. But we have our maintenance crew go out and we're like, hey, don't worry, we'll fix that for you. We find that we don't have to be, all we have to do is be better than the other agencies in our community in terms of how they are responsive to the landlords, whether they move somebody into housing and then call in 3 months just to see how they're doing, or if we show up the next day. So there is some element of like, the bar's pretty low generally on how social service agencies interact with landlords. And you can establish yourselves as sort of the golden child of agencies by just answering the damn phone most of the time. So does that solve the entire problem? Does that undo the woes of capitalism that we are all dealing with and trying to figure out how to get people into housing when they make $800 a month and housing costs $2,000 a month? It doesn't. But we are constantly going to be looking in the gaps and finding ways that we can fill in those gaps. And we're not going to solve the problem all at once. Like Jonathan said, we're not just going to go build 3,000 units of permanent supportive housing, and that ship's not coming. So we have to find other ways. And when we do that, we can make impact for each person that we're working with and then just do it again.
Can I just
Thank
like
you
echo
so
that,
much.
like John, that like 100%. Being the one who calls, like picks up the landlord, like making a landlord your number one priority, that rode us through the first year of the pandemic, because we were responsive. I got the check, I'll be right over, like all of that made it so much easier. And the one other thing that we do, we have a zero right of refusal for a permanent housing exit. Now, within the constructs of like it's safe, it's the right, mix for your family size, all that kind of stuff. But, we don't allow people to say like, no, I'm waiting for this building to open, or like, I'm waiting for this subsidy type to come in. It's like, if your name comes up, this is an emergency situation. You are in an emergency. And if you can deny a housing opportunity, you're telling me you're not in an emergency and you don't need to be here. And so we always say, like, if you deny it, you get a 7-day discharge letter. I can tell you we've been doing that for 4 years. Not one single person has ever left the shelter in a negative discharge from that. It has been something that has been incredibly, an incredible contributor, I think, to our success.
Thank you. And we have to transfer over to Kay because we have 2 minutes. So I'm so sorry. It's like a gazillion questions we did not get to. So we'll figure that out. I think maybe people can answer them via like email. So I want to turn it over to Kay. I want to thank our presenters. You guys were amazing. And I'm so sorry we ran out of time because I think there's so much more that could be shared. Kay, are you here?
Yes.
Okay, you are
Quickly.
muted and you're sharing different the presenter lens, just FYI.
Oh, so it's the wrong one. Hang on. Now I don't know how to get out of that presenter lens. I'm just gonna hang on, y'all. I'm sorry. I'm just escaping.
Go to the display settings, you can swap them.
Stop sharing and then start sharing again. And when you start sharing again, pick the one that's full screen.
All right. Did it stop sharing?
I got you, Kay. Go ahead.
All right. So Josh got me. Thank you so much. I'm just saying quickly, the slide that's up on the screen, right? The 5 keys to emergency shelter. We have a link on our website. I'm not going to go over that, but everybody talked about these things. It's not just one. It's not just about being low barrier. It's not just about being housing focused. It's not just about being housing first. It all comes together, and it's super important to remember that. And the next slide, quickly, Josh. Josh redid this slide to make it more pleasant so that you all could see it, but really thinking about what your role is, and that, I think sometimes we get caught up in what a shelter is and our shelter and our issues, but really thinking about that you are you're like so critical in how we end homelessness in our community, both to get people in, the shelters have such a huge impact on reducing unsheltered homelessness by listening to what people need. Rachel is putting some things in chat so that you can see that. And just the next slide quickly, Josh, there, just when you really think about it, it's just, it does mean a philosophical shift. And you heard everybody talk about that philosophical shift. And it can take some time for some people and not as much for others. But ultimately, what you want to make sure is that your shelter is got that mission that we are here to end homelessness, not just to have a shelter bed and offer shelter bed, but we are a critical part of ending homelessness. You all, next slide, you all were amazing. I mean, I was mesmerized the whole time. I'm clapping in the background. I'm doing woohoos. Every time I hear one of you say something, I've learned so much just from being here today. And, you know, we're at the Alliance and we still learn from the things that you do. So here's everybody's information, their email addresses, the slides are going out. You can add, you know, email each of these, but Nichelle, thank you so much for moderating, and Michelle and Jonathan and Mary Beth and John. Oh my God, awesome. You all are great. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. The chat was amazing, and let's keep our conversations going. Thank you so much.